Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 45 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, let's see. The first thing I wanted to do was, I had this plan to have a 1 year birthday party on the podcast for Camera Position, and Camera Position's birthday snuck up past me by while I wasn't looking. February 5th of 2006 was my first Camera Position podcast, and here we are at February 19th, 2007. So the birthday kind of slid by, but first of all, I'd like to thank everybody who's been along for the ride. I hope you're learning some things. I hope you're having some fun listening to these ideas about photography, and I know I'm having some fun doing it, so let's look forward to another great year of podcasting. I had planned on getting 52 in. 52, one for every week of the year, but fell shy by a few. Not too bad, but I'm having a good time accomplishing these, although occasionally the real world steps in and gets in the way. So thanks to those of you who've been there and are continuing to listen. And also just, if you're finding something useful here, send somebody that you know an email and say, hey, there's some cool stuff over here. Take a look. Couple of 3 weeks ago, we talked about the zone system of exposure and the ideas behind the zone system, with the idea that the zone system is in fact a creative tool in photography. It in fact, for me, is one of the primary creative tools because it is the thing that allows me to forget about the technology of photography and allows me to concentrate on what it is that I am interested in terms of picture making. So, first of all, in this second part, what I want to do is I want to spend some time talking about some more specifics about the zone system. And just like the last time when I talked about the zone system, I have produced a fairly good-sized PDF handout. This one is 11 pages long and is available from the cameraposition.com blog page. I would encourage you to go ahead and download this. Boy, not too many downloaded the first one. And I have put these together exclusively for Camera Position listeners. So go to cameraposition.com for the blog post for this particular episode and take a look at what I've created for you here. I think you'll find it to be a useful tool to help you kind of look at some of those concepts. I will be including some of the images that are in this handout here in the enhanced podcast, and also putting a few of them on the cameraposition.com blog. Most of them are kind of graphical things, not photographic things. So I think it helps you kind of understand how this whole thing works a little bit better. But it's important at the outset here to remember that our goal is to think about this idea of technology, this idea of technique in photography as a not an end unto itself, but rather just a means to the end. And the end, of course, is the image. The stuff that is really important is, what am I making a photograph of? Why does the subject matter to me? How can I convey my own feelings about this subject in a photograph? And more importantly for our discussion, what do I want this photograph to look like when it's completed? Because the whole concept of the zone system is based on a sort of mind's eye rendition of what it is that the photograph should look like in terms of its completed product once we're done with it. And we have to remember that the technology of photography is there to serve our creative vision, the creative vision that we have, that we bring to the medium as photographers. And so the zone system, for me anyway, has been a terrific tool to help me forget about the problems of the technical side of photography and be able to concentrate on actually making images and have those images turn out the way I want them to in my mind's eye when I am standing in front of a subject. So a little review, I think, is in order. In the podcast about the zone system part 1, we learned a bunch of things. We learned about light meters seeing middle gray. We learned about how we can make light meters smarter by only really being smarter about what we aim them at. And aiming them at important parts of our scene helps us to gain some control over what the light meter sees and therefore what that light meter tells us. We also looked at the idea of apertures and shutter speeds having that 1-to-2 relationship, half as much, twice as much, and the idea of the zone system dividing that dark to light scale up into 11 zones or areas of tone, and that the zones have a relationship of 1 to 2, just like the apertures and shutter speeds do, so that each zone represents twice as much or half as much brightness. We talked about how zone 5 is middle gray on the zone system scale, and that is what light meters want to see and want to create in our photographs. And moving then one aperture or shutter speed in one direction or another changes the exposure of an object by one zone. One zone, one aperture, one shutter speed, all the same stuff, right? So again, some more review here. The idea of changing an exposure in our cameras changes all the values along the scale. So if we make our exposure lighter by one stop or one zone, everything in our photograph gets lighter. If we make it darker by one stop or one zone, everything gets darker. The idea then also of placing an object that has a given amount of reflectance at a particular zone on the scale. We simply have to meter that object with our meter and then figure out how far away from middle gray that object falls. So placing that object, deciding what value it is, and one of the things we talked about is what's the right value, and the right value is the one that makes sense to us. So the idea here is that this is a flexible system of exposure and a flexible system of allowing us to get what it is that we would like to see in our photographs appearing in our exposures in the way that we want them to. So, but as you might suspect, because photography has some technical limitations, and because those technical limits change a little bit depending on what material is being used, whether it's negative film or transparency film or digital capture. And my presumption here is that the majority of the listeners out there are doing digital capture. I know that there are a lot of film users out there as well. I know I'm one. So we'll try to hit all of these things, both film and digital, and how that works. These technical limitations aren't really deal breakers in terms of how they impact us with the zone system, but they certainly do change things a little bit. And one of the things that we have to do in applying these principles is think about how light actually affects light-sensitive materials, whether it's film or a digital sensor, during exposure. And then there is also the issue of what happens after an exposure is made, whether in the computer or in a traditional darkroom. We can exert some post-exposure control on the way an image looks. So part of the deal here is trying to remember that this is a technological medium that we have embraced here. It is very different, I think, in many respects from other creative media, in that there is underlying technology that we have to kind of climb a mountain around. You know, we have to kind of figure out how to get from here to there. The whole concept here is that photography is based on light and light's response to the materials that we are recording an image with. And those responses differ depending on what kind of material we're looking at. So here we have an image of a curve. A curve that we have looked at in photography. For those of you who've been involved in photography for a long time, you've probably seen these curves before. They have been around for a long time, and they are based on the science of sensitometry, or measuring the sensitivity and response of various light-sensitive materials. In making up these curves for you, by the way, what I've done is faded back, used a bunch of Photoshop layers here, and I've faded back the curves that are not being discussed at the particular time, because we're going to go through black and white film, color negative film, transparency film, and digital capture curves. And I've faded back the ones that are not being discussed so that not only can you see the one that we're talking about, but also you can see how that curve relates to the other ones that we're not talking about. So hopefully it won't be too confusing to you, but it is, I think, a useful way for us to kind of compare these curves against one another. And what we do with these curves is we plot the density of our material, the density that we get out of either film or, in the case of digital images, the values we achieve with digital images against the total amount of exposure. Now, let me tell you right off the bat, if you're thinking, "Oh my God, it's a graph," and I'm math phobic, you're not alone. I know a lot of photographers, including me, who are math phobic. So these are not complicated graphs, and ultimately, especially for you digital folks, this will make some sense because we'll relate this idea to the digital photography histogram down the road here a little bit in this particular podcast. So this first curve is a curve that represents black and white negative film. And some interesting things, if you look at the curve, the film density against the total exposure or amount of light, that first of all, it takes a little bit of light to get the film's response moving. In other words, it takes some light for the film to start to react in some way. And what we'll do here, by the way, is we'll go through the various curves that represent the responses of different kinds of materials. So what we get with black and white negative film is we get a curve that starts out with very little exposure density, or very little, rather, film density being achieved by increased exposure. But gradually, as exposure begins to increase, the film's density begins to increase. And eventually, we get to a point where an amount of exposure relates to a certain amount of film density. So what we're looking at the bottom of the curve there is the shadow stuff, and at the top end of the curve we're looking at the highlight stuff, or the dense parts of our film negative. So that idea of how the film's curve responds to light takes a little bit of light to get it going. There is a straight line section where there is an equivalent amount of light exposure that equates to an equivalent amount of film density. And then you'll notice at the top that of this curve that the curve starts to tail off. In other words, increased exposure yields no usable increase in density. So let's sort of look at this against the zone system. If we think about it from the zone system point of view, that bottom of the curve, the dark areas, are zones 0 and 1. 1 is that place where the zone begins to, or the film rather, begins to achieve some significant density that makes a difference in density in the print. And then at the top end of the scale, that's like zone 9, zone 10, where what we get is increased exposure yields no increase in film density. And we can print that thing as long as we want. We can leave that enlarger light on as long as we want. We won't get anything other than a sort of lifeless gray out of our image. With black and white film, though, we have one significant trick up our sleeve, and that significant trick is development of the film. By changing or altering the length of time that film is developed, we can alter where those highlight values fall on that curve. So in other words, by developing the film a little bit longer, we can make areas that we'd like to have be a little bit brighter, a little bit denser. We could have them fall a little bit farther up the curve by developing the film longer. By developing the film a little less time, we can make bright values of the scene fall a little bit farther down the curve. So we can control contrast range with black and white film by making sure that we have development correct. And that's where that old adage, expose for the shadows, develop for the highlights, comes from. You may have heard that in photography circles before. Expose for the highlights, develop for the shadows suggests that what we want to do with black and white film is make sure that our shadow or dark end exposures work out to be the value or the zone that we'd like them to be. And then we make sure that the highlight values don't fall too far up on the scale so that they block up, or too far down on the scale so that they're too gray. And we do that through altering development. Now, if we go and take a look at color negative film is slightly different in terms of its response. Color negative film can capture a little bit less brightness range than black and white film can, where black and white film can get maybe 9 or 10 stops or zones of range. Color negative film really can only get maybe 6 or 7 stops of brightness range in terms of textured range of values. That means that zone 2 becomes our darkest tone, and zone 7 or so becomes our lightest tone. And if we keep the important parts of our subject within that range, our exposures will be predictable and they'll be accurate. Color negative films have another significant difference, though, because changes in development do not result in any changes in highlight density. And because of that, it's very, very important that we keep our exposures within that straight line part of the film's response curve. And another helpful characteristic of color negative films is that they tend to have a rather broad exposure latitude, meaning that while it isn't ideal in terms of negative exposure to underexpose a little bit or overexpose a little bit, we can usually get a little bit of underexposure, maybe a stop or so, or even 2 or so stops of overexposure before things kind of tend to head south. So one of the terrific parts about color negative films, and certainly one of the big parts that had made them a huge staple in the consumer photographic industry, is that they were very forgiving of exposure errors. So this little curve here of color negative film shows you the sort of way in which color negative film responds to light. Now, very briefly, and I'm guessing there aren't too terribly many people out there shooting color transparency film, but briefly, color transparency or slide material is even more finicky than any of these other materials. And that is because not only is there no development control over contrast range, but the contrast range is pretty narrow, only about 4.5 or 5 stops, as compared with the wider range of color negative materials, both black and white negative and color negative materials. So when working with color transparency materials, one of the big deals is that it's better to place high values, since the color slides are direct positives, and the high values are where the lowest density of the color dyes that make up the image occur. And you want to be able to control those areas. So we need to do the opposite thing that we do with negatives. Expose for the highlights and let the shadows fall where they may, or alternately, control shadow density with lighting or with some sort of bounce reflection or something to increase the value or the brightness of those shadow areas. So the reason that I spent some time talking here about color transparency materials is that color transparency materials turn out to be very much like, in some ways anyway, digital materials. And digital materials also have a sort of an odd propensity to, just like color transparency materials, blow out highlight details. And we'll take a look at that, and probably the best way to take a look at it is to look at the curve response for digital capture with digital cameras. So the curve, you'll notice, is quite different. And the basic ideas of measuring light and making exposure hold true in this world of digital photography. But with film, we've seen that it takes a certain amount of light to start the film's response kind of moving. That is, to get it to zone 1, where we get some significant effect of light's effect on the film material, and that the film's density changes more in middle zones than it does in the dark and light zones. But the sensors in digital cameras have a linear response to the action of light. So like film, it takes digital cameras sensors a little bit of time or a little bit of light energy to get them moving. But once they start responding to light, they respond in a linear fashion all the way up the scale. An equal amount of light responds to an equal amount of value that is achieved in the sensor of the digital camera. So a good digital camera, one of the what I would call good to better DSLRs, can capture textured information somewhere in the area of 7 zones, from about zone 1 or zone 2 to zone 7. And the zone system concepts still apply, except for the fact that we have this extraordinarily abrupt fall off or drop off of data right at the end of the high end of the system. So the idea here is that you can't overexpose digital camera pictures because, and I'm sure you've discovered this, because if you do, there will be no highlight detail there, and there is no way that you can get it back. And for those of you who have been in photography long enough and have shot transparency materials, you may have encountered this same thing with transparency materials with color slides. If you shoot a color slide and you overexpose it, those highlight details are blown out and there is no way to get them back. So with that information in hand, it would seem as though the same basic concepts, we can make placements and find out where the other tones fall, and maybe we should take that same strategy as transparency films and make exposures at the high end of the scale and figure out where the dark areas are going to fall. Well, on one hand, that doesn't seem to be too bad an idea, right? Not too terribly bad a strategy, but it's not quite that easy, unfortunately, and that has to do with problems related to bit depth. Bit depth. Well, bit depth is a term that I'm sure you've heard in digital photography at some point, and maybe you've gotten it and maybe you haven't. And I'll tell you, it took me a while to kind of wrap my mind around this idea. And the concept here is that digital photographs are, well, they're digital. And that means that our digital exposures are built up of strings of ones and zeros, or bits, that make up the digital universe. Everything inside that computer is made up of just strings of ones and zeros, ons and offs, yeses and nos. Because we record our images with ones and zeros, and because we are sort of tied with digital photography to this digital universe, there are some issues that are related to digital photographic exposures that compromise the information used to describe dark values and favors the information that's used to describe light values. And I'll see what I can do to explain this to you, although it's helpful, I think, to have a table, and there is a table in this PDF document that I've created for you. And I'll put a picture of the table on the cameraposition.com blog, but as long as you're there looking at that, you might as well look at the PDF document because it'll, I think, make a little bit more sense there. So let's see if I can wrap your head around this, because it did take me a while to figure this out in my own mind. If we shoot a JPEG image in the camera, we get a file that captures 8 bits of data per pixel. And that 8 bits of data, as I'm sure that those of you who are dealing with digital photography knows, that 8 bits of data represents a total of 256 different levels of brightness per pixel per channel. Again, one channel each for red, green, and blue. When that happens, half of the 256 levels go towards recording the brightest stop, or the brightest zone. So half of the 256 levels that are available, 128 levels, go towards describing the brightest value in your picture. Half of the remaining levels the remaining 128 levels go toward recording the next brightest stop. Half of what's left after that, 64 levels, goes toward recording the next brightest stop, and so on for the rest of the stops. There is a straight linear halving of data for each stop on down the scale. So when we get down to the darkest textured areas of the image, we usually have only 4, or in some cases, depending on the exposure, 2 levels recording that detail, meaning that we wind up with texture, what we'd call texture anyway, being recorded by only 2 or 4 different values. And as you probably figured out by now, we can't describe much delicate texture with those few values. So with the zone system, as it applies to digital photography, we want to place the highlights and then let the shadows fall where they will. But we have to make sure that if there's important shadow detail, those shadows don't fall far down on the exposure scale, because if they fall too far down, then we're going to have problems with not being able to resolve detail in those shadow areas. So if you've ever tried to eke out some detail in Photoshop in your digital photograph, you've probably figured out that, boy, there's not much data down there, down at that low end or dark end of the scale. So we just have to be aware that when we meter something and place it on the high value, we don't get too much farther up the scale than, say, zone 7, and we try really hard to make sure that our low values don't fall too far down the scale. Say maybe zone 2 might be our maximum dark value that we would want to try to record any kind of detail in, but frankly, zone 3 would make a lot more sense. But there is a solution, or at least a partial solution, and that is the raw file. Now, for some of you, this will be, old news because you've been shooting raw files for a long time. For others, you may have heard about raw files and not really sure what to make of them, or not really sure why you would shoot them in addition to or instead of JPEGs. And I'll tell you, with my digital photography, I'm not shooting anything other than raw files anymore. Boy, unless it is just some sort of a toss-off picture that I just don't care about quality in. But the raw file is significant because most of the better cameras out there capture raw files at 12 bits of data per pixel. There are a few of the very high-end cameras that capture 14 bits of data per pixel, but the majority of what I would call the good to better DSLRs, or even some of the better point-and-shoot style digital cameras, capture 12 bits of data per pixel. Now, the significant aspect there is that with 12 bits of data per pixel, what you get is 4,096 levels per pixel per channel for your image. 4,096 levels. Now, quickly do the math and figure out that there is a fairly significant difference between 4,096 levels in a 12-bit file and 256 levels in an 8-bit file. So here's the deal. If you capture a 12-bit file, what you get is 4,096 levels in total for your entire picture, which means that what you record is 2,048 levels that deal with or record the brightest stop or brightest zone in your picture, and then 1,024 levels recording the next darker stop in your picture, and then on down the scale, 512, 256, and if you keep going down, you'll discover that the darkest zone has 16 levels dealing with the darkest area of your picture, which would be zone 0. So, of course, something lighter than that would have at least 32 levels of value, which obviously is going to give a significantly better rendition of subtle value differences at the dark end of the scale. Certainly much better than an 8-bit file. So obviously this high bit depth solution is a really good one for photographers. But wait, there's more, because in addition to not only getting a great deal more data at the bottom end of the scale, there is also the additional exposure headroom that the file has, usable exposure that is both above and beyond what we can capture with a JPEG file. This headroom can be accessed and can be manipulated with software that can decode or read the raw file. There is a downside here, and the downside is that every raw file that you shoot has to be manipulated in some way, though we're getting better and better tools for that all the time. Adobe Camera Raw in combination with Adobe Bridge in the latest version of Adobe Photoshop, the CS2 version, and the CS3 version is going to offer even more opportunities. And then there's also software packages like Adobe's new Lightroom software or Apple's Aperture. Some people use Bibble. That's another software that can interpret raw files. There are a number of them out there, which also include, by the way, the camera manufacturer's software that comes with your cameras on your camera's CD that comes along with the camera, that also can be useful. Although really more and more people are standardizing on things like the Adobe Camera Raw module or Adobe Lightroom or Apple's Aperture software. And this post-processing has both a downside and an upside. The downside, of course, is that every file has to be massaged in some way. The upside is that we're getting better and better tools to massage many of these files in an automatic or at least semi-automatic fashion, but also that we have this analogy then to that development control and printing control that we would have in the traditional darkroom. So if we think back earlier on in the podcast to the idea of black and white film and the way in which black and white film's exposure is sort of tied to or shadow detail is tied to exposure, but highlight detail could be adjusted over a fairly good-sized range by adjusting development of the film. But with RAW files, we not only have the ability to sort of post-process control these files, but we also have the ability to do a great deal more than we could in the black and white darkroom. And unlike in the black and white darkroom, where developing film was more or less a blind affair, now in Adobe Camera Raw or any of these other Aperture Lightroom kinds of products, we're doing things right out there in the open, in the light. So we're able to make a great deal more interactive control over our images. So another advantage here in the digital realm is that we can use the histogram on the camera's LCD display, and then again later on the computer, that histogram, a distribution graph of how many values are at different points on the scale from dark to light, to be able to read where our exposure falls on a scale. And as you might have guessed, as we've gone along through this discussion of exposure, the histogram has some pretty strong parallels to the zone system's zone scale. And I've given you a graphic here of the way those two things fit together, that the zone system's zone scale is in fact really just a histogram sort of masquerading. That zone scale, zone 0, really quite accurately relates to the level 0 on the histogram. Zone 10 relates quite accurately to level 10 on the histogram. Middle gray, you can see, falls pretty much exactly where middle gray falls on the histogram. Now, a common thing that people have with histograms, and that's, I should dispel that rumor right now, some people want their histograms to look like this beautiful bell curve with very few values at the dark end and very few values at the light end, and this big, beautiful, smooth lump of value at in the middle. And I'll tell you that a lot of histograms will look like that, but only if you take pictures of things that are mostly middle values, which have gradual fall off to the dark and light values. Because again, what a histogram is simply a distribution graph. It is a graph of the distribution of values along your image. So when we're looking at that histogram, if we're taking a picture of things that are mostly light in value, the histogram is going to be shoved over toward the right side or looking like mostly light values. If in fact we're looking at the dark values in an image, and it is an image that is comprised mostly of dark values, well, then the histogram is going to be shoved over more toward the left. The thing we have to remember is that the histogram is an indicator only. It is just sort of a general guideline of where our exposure has fallen within that scale. And obviously, now that we know what we know about digital exposure, we want to make sure that the histogram's light values don't get bumped up against the right side of the histogram's display. And dark values, of course, we don't want to bury either, because that means we won't have very much control over how much dark value separation of tone we have in our photograph. So the histogram really is just sort of a guideline, and it's especially worth pointing out that with raw files, your camera's histogram can really be only used as a sort of general estimate of the overall exposure, because what it's doing is really displaying 8-bit data that it extrapolates from your higher bit depth raw file. But still, it's a pretty good indication that you haven't created an exposure that goes too far toward one end of the exposure scale or the other. Well, now that we've got some conceptual and theoretical understanding of how all of this works, the next question is, what the heck do you do next? Where do you go with all of this information, and how do you, quote unquote, do the zone system? Well, first we have to remember that the zone system is really all about making images of things that we want to make images of, and that we're going to learn a lot about how the zone system, and not coincidentally photography, works when we make some photographs and then process and evaluate those photographs. So the best way to start is to just jump in and start making some photographs. Make some photographs by placing the important low values of the subject on the proper zone for that subject. And remember that we do that by metering the significant dark area in the photograph, and only that dark area, making sure that the meter doesn't see all of the bright values of our picture, and place that dark area on a dark or low zone by remembering that the meter wants to create middle gray and then closing down 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 stops or zones to make that area the zone we want it to be, 1 zone or 2 zones or 3 zones, etc., darker than middle gray. And again, how do we know what the proper zone is? Well, the beauty of this zone system is that we get to make the decision based on how we want to see the finished image in our mind's eye. So the idea is that what we're doing is looking at, well, what do we want this picture to eventually look like? How bright or dark do we want this object to be? So make a bunch of photographs like that. Maybe make 30 or 40 photographs like that, placing the low values on the low zones. And then process those images and take a look and see what they look like. Once you've made some images by placing the low zones, make more images by placing high zones. Remember that to do this, we meter the significant light area in the photograph, and again, limit our meter so that we only see the light areas, and then place that light area on a light or high zone by remembering that the meter wants to see middle gray, and then opening up 1 or 2 or 3 stops or zones to make that light area the zone we want it to be. Pick the zone we think is right, make the exposure, and then process and evaluate the images that we make. And what we do when we evaluate those images is we get to see, well, what is it that this particular zone or tone looks like? When I open up 2 stops from metering this object, what is that going to look like? What does the resultant photograph look like when it is finally done? In both of those situations above, both metering low values and placing them and metering high values and placing them, you've ignored the contrast of the scene. You've metered and exposed only for one end of the scale. The next step then is to expose for one end of the scale and then meter the opposite end and find out how many stops or zones apart the 2 important values are. If, for example, you place a dark area on zone 3 and the important light area is 4 stops or zones more reflective, then it falls on zone 7. Then more of your judgment comes into call. Is that an acceptable idea of your original visualization of the image? If not, you may want to rethink your visualization. You may want to rethink how it is that you think this picture should look. Or you may know that in post-production, after the picture has been captured, you may decide to develop the film or process the digital file in a different way, because the zone system allows you to become the maker of your images. It allows technical control, certainly, but what it really allows is tremendous creative control. And it is, in fact, one of my most important creative tools in photography, and it's the thing that allows me to kind of tuck all of the dumb, dopey technology of photography into my back pocket and not have to think about it anymore. I don't really want to think about whether my pictures will come out. I don't want to think about whether I'll get what I really think I should get. I want to know that I'm going to get that stuff so that I can concentrate on finding subjects that are meaningful to me and making photographs of those subjects that convey that meaning to the viewers of the photograph. So I would encourage you to take a look at these ideas, try to get your arms wrapped around the technical problems of photography, and really just sort of assimilate them, learn them so that you don't have to think about them anymore. I'd like to equate it maybe to driving a car. You know, now those of you who are out there driving cars every day, you don't think about the things that you're doing in the car the same way that you did when you first began to drive a car, about how to shift and how to steer and how to do all of the things with braking and accelerating. No, you just get into the car and do it, and you simply trust your reflexes. And if you can make the technical side of photography that kind of reflex action, the same kind of reflex action that you get when driving a car or doing some other reflexive kind of thing, what you'll get is a focus not on the technology of the medium, but rather on the creative possibilities of this incredibly wonderful and creatively beautiful medium. So thanks again for being here. I really appreciate those of you who have been along for this year-long ride, and I look forward to seeing you on future episodes of Camera Position. And what we'll do in the future is return again to some of the aesthetic concepts of the medium of photography, leave some of these technical things behind for a while. And so we'll see you looking at some more aesthetic concepts on the next episode of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography. Camera Position is a proud member of the Photocast Network, your photo resource in the potosphere. photocastnetwork.com